As the government paves way for economic reforms and implements strategies to cushion the impacts affecting different sectors, the government itself, to some extent, has tried to be more informative as to how it is addressing critical issues, especially issues that are not helping in just progressing Zambia's economic status. This morning, we discuss more with the media consultant on the state of Zambia's economy. And with him, we also focus on the 7 MOUs that were signed between Zambia and Rwanda, and how can this assist in the development of the country itself and improve Zambia's economic status. We discuss more with Mr. Kellis Kaunda, who is a media consultant. Good morning and welcome to The Breakfast Show.
Thank you very much and good morning.
Let's get straight into it and first begin with the issue of the 7 MOUs that were signed between Zambia and Rwanda. And this was concluded just yesterday. We did see the Rwandan president and the Zambian president have bilateral talks, and these MOUs being signed obviously because of trying to strengthen international relations between the two countries. But overall, let's begin firstly with the 3rd MOU that was signed, and this is on agriculture. Do you think that this is something that Zambia should consistently capitalize on, especially when we speak on having to increase the development of agriculture in Zambia, which ultimately will see the increase in Zambia's economic status and betterment of it?
Yeah. First, it's important to see the context of Zambia-Rwanda relations and how this trip came about. Remember that when this president came into office, in terms of his foreign policy trajectory, he recommitted himself to economic diplomacy. And economic diplomacy means that you are using foreign relations for the purposes of tapping into the resources that are available beyond the borders of your country, and use that to leverage your domestic economic activities and efforts. So in this perspective, the president did indicate at the beginning of his term of office that Zambia was going to continue improving on the existing relations with neighboring countries in the region and at an international level. So the visit by the president of Rwanda, Zambia, must be seen in that context. Then why agriculture, for instance? Why agriculture? Because if you listened to the statement that was issued by the information minister, Chushi, when she was announcing that the cabinet has approved the 8th National Development Plan, the statement also indicated that agriculture has been identified as a driver for economic transformation. So from the Zambian perspective, agriculture is big, and agriculture is important and is going to play a very pivotal role in the efforts to transform the Zambian economy. Remember, the Zambian economy has been very dependent on copper. And the problem of dependence on one commodity is that when the prices plummet, then you have a problem. That's why even at a business level, you want to have multiple sources of income. On the Rwandan side, about 40% or so of that country's GDP is agriculture. So when you sit around the same table with a country that shares the same resources as you, then you have something in common. So you can exchange technology, you can exchange challenges, but it also becomes a business opportunity for for populations on both sides. Now, what the framework simply does is to, first of all, officially agree that this is one sector in which we need to focus. But beyond that, the responsibility to actualize this will be the private sector. So the kind of leadership that government is going to provide will determine as to whether this MOU in the agricultural sector materializes. But the bottom line is that there are huge opportunities because the larger population of Zambian people are employed in the agricultural sector. And so is the same thing with Rwanda. So for anyone that wants to go into business and who wants to know where the opportunities lie, it is in agriculture. But whether this succeeds or not depends on, one, the leadership that the Zambian government will continue to provide and the kind of synergies that the Zambian government creates with the private sector that is involved in the agricultural business.
Well, it's very interesting that we even speak of agriculture, but we cannot speak of that without having to speak on cross-border trade. And this is one of the 7 MOUs that was signed between Zambia and Rwanda. This one speaking on Trade and Investment Corporation, which is aimed at promoting cross-border trade, investments and private sector development between the parties on equitable terms. But with regards to this particular MOU itself, how do you feel this is going to assist in just boosting Zambia's economic status?
In diplomacy, there is also one component of economic diplomacy known as trade diplomacy. And that's what SADC has been doing for many years, discussing things like how do you make it easy for goods manufactured in Zimbabwe to come into Zambia, and Zambia goods going into Zimbabwe. You remember that at some point the issue of import tariffs was very topical. That cooking oil in Zambia at some point would be more costly than cooking oil coming from Zimbabwe. There was also a question at some point of South Africa, turning Southern Africa into into a dumping ground, of goods. So the issue of trade diplomacy is very, very critical in order to level the playing field. So in this case, what Zambia and Rwanda has decided in this context is that since there is already and there's going to be an increase of goods and services between Zambia and Rwanda, can we have a framework that will be able to talk about these import duties? Because import duties have a tendency sometimes to build unnecessary advantages of one country at the expense of the other. So this must be seen in that context. But once again, this cannot be actualized without the involvement of the business community. So what sort of leadership the Zambian government provides and the synergies that they create with the private sector will determine as to whether this MOU lives up to its expectations or not.
And the issue of health also was one of the MOUs that was signed, and this being done obviously to facilitate the movement of persons between the two countries. But generally, when we speak about health here in Zambia, we've seen how the health sector has struggled in the last couple of years in terms of it's just being able to sustain certain individuals within the sector itself. Do you think that having to sign an MOU like this will also be an advantage for the health sector?
Yes, and this must be understood from, first of all, a global perspective. The reason why WHO was formed was for purposes of monitoring global, global diseases that go globally, and also to recognize the fact that people are ever on the move. So there must be, at a global level, some mechanism to understand what is happening and be able to deploy preventive mechanisms and also empower individual nations in dealing with those issues. In developed countries, the idea of surveillance at a global level as part of their foreign policy has been there for a long time. Centers for Disease Control in the United States has been part and parcel of the country's foreign policy and security requirements. That is why for CDC, what has been happening in the past is that wherever a pandemic or a new disease breaks out, they'll be able to deploy their experts immediately. Because of these large movements that people do, it's very easy within a short period of time to import a disease into another country. And now seeing that there's a volume of traffic in terms of human beings between Rwanda and Zambia, it becomes important that the issue of health becomes part and parcel of the framework of cooperation. So that if there is a disease that has broken out in Zambia, the Zambian authorities must be able to inform their counterparts in Rwanda. The same thing, pardon me, the same thing when their counterparts in Rwanda have noticed a disease that has broken out. But then you also want to standardize how you do surveillance so that you know that if this has been identified in a laboratory in Rwanda, it should be credible in the Zambian laboratories as well. So the issue of health has become part and parcel of diplomatic relations, but it has also become part and parcel of national security.
Let's speak on Zambia's tax policy regime. I know this is an area that requires critical attention, and it also was one of the MOUs that was, well, not the tax policy regime, but what was signed was the mutual administrative assistance between the Rwanda Revenue Authority and the Zambia Revenue Authority, meant to cooperate in a joint effort to curb the contravention of tax laws. Do you think that this being done could assist in Zambia's tax policy regime?
Yes, and I'm also glad that the two countries were thinking along what is happening at a global level. What has been happening at a global level for a very long time is that people have found very clever ways of evading tax responsibilities. You find that someone opens a bank account in another country so that when they are paid for goods and services, those monies are paid into that account so that they are unable to pay tax in their own country. So now what is happening is that even if you are seated here and you want to open an account either in Zimbabwe or South Africa and things like that, they're going to ask for your tax PIN identification number. And the reason for that is that they want to share that with authorities where you live so that you are not misusing the globalization of the financial system in order to benefit yourself and then undermine your country's ability to raise taxes. So it is important that this is signed between Zambia and Rwanda because one, to address that issue, but also for purposes of, if I've paid tax on goods that I'm going to sell in Rwanda, or someone in Rwanda has already paid tax on that, you must be able to ensure that somebody is not taxed twice. So the issue of tax as part of economic diplomacy is huge around the world, and Zambians must understand it in that context.
Still on the issue of Zambia's economic diplomacy, we've seen the president having to visit different countries, especially within the southern region, and his goal obviously is to create that diplomatic relation and possibly pave way for Zambia's economy to be open to Southern Africa and the rest of the world. But overall, speaking on what is currently happening and the state of Zambia's economy, 8 months after the UPND formed government, many seem to have lost confidence, especially when we speak on some of the promises that the UPND government made. And this was on the economic reforms that will be implemented. And 8 months down the line, it still seems it's a difficult path, not only for the government, but even for the Zambian people. With all these doors that are being opened, all these doors that are being created by the president himself, do you think that the next few months will be better for Zambia?
Well, see, ideally, you'd like to believe that these interactions should be able to translate into a relief for Zambians and bringing resources or contributing to the expansion of the economy. But you need to understand that life doesn't work in a straight path. Sometimes it doesn't matter how much you are focused on a particular ideal, and it doesn't matter how you have articulated your public policy, and it doesn't matter how clear you might be. There will always be developments along the way that will be able to make it difficult for you to realize what you want. For instance, who knew that there's going to be a war in Ukraine, a war that is going to have this kind of ripple effects across the world? That is why in public policy we have a model known as a punctuated equilibrium model, or the punctuated equilibrium theory, that tends to explain those developments that you did not expect happening. So, yes, ideally, these kinds of interactions are laying a foundation for the kind of interactions that should bring these kinds of resources that we need for purposes of growing the Zambian economy. One can only hope and trust that first the leadership in government as well as the civil service will put their minds to this by ensuring that they are able to identify various stakeholders. This is what we sometimes call in diplomacy stakeholder diplomacy. There is nothing that you as a government can decide that is going to come to fruition without identifying other stakeholders. Whatever movement the president makes in the region It can only be actualized if the civil service, the political leadership has identified appropriately who the stakeholders are that they are going to work with. But it's also important that the media and parliament, they bring pressure to bear on government to make sure that all these trips that are being made, that they are able to show value for money. But we're not asking these critical questions. Even after these MOUs have been signed, after the president of Rwanda has left, this might be the end. And there's going to be another story. And yet, if we are able to archive this and be able to draw up a plan where we are going to monitor the actualization of this, we'll be able to then realize benefits from each and every trip that the president makes.
As we get to conclude our conversation here, and speaking on the issue of Zambia's economic status, we know that one of the things that will constantly have us go towards a downtrend is corruption in the country. And in the years before, we have seen how corruption has affected Zambia's economic status. And one of the things that the European government has been open about is how they would like to be transparent in the fight against corruption. Now, just from yesterday, we did see the Director of Public Prosecution, Enta Enole, on this issue, Mr. Milingo Lungu's case. Do you think that the fight against corruption under the European government is being as transparent as they are saying it is?
The fight against corruption in this country has always been mad in political rhetoric and political innuendos and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is this: Zambia has had a problem with corruption for far too long, and the reason for that is that our governance systems have not been sufficiently transparent to inspire that kind of confidence. You remember at the height of the privatization program and what followed after that, there's been a huge outcry to this day that the privatization program in this country was not done in a transparent fashion. So one of the things that we need to start doing as Zambians is to ask ourselves, what do we mean by transparency? Is there some pieces of legislation that we need to interrogate so that, clearly that would indicate that this is transparency? I think for me, we haven't really defined what that transparency means. And also, secondly, this whole business of seeing institutions of investigations, that investigate crimes, appearing to suddenly become busy after an election, that also doesn't inspire confidence, because it portrays the picture that these institutions are getting instructions from those in power. So a politically driven fight against corruption doesn't inspire confidence. Remember that those that are in power also have self-serving reasons. They were in the opposition in the past. These institutions investigated them. Now they are in power. The institutions are suddenly investigating those that were investigating them before. I think Zambians must find a way of ensuring that the laws that protect these institutions cannot be touched by anyone who comes into power, so that this narrative that portrays corruption as a tool to politically persecute somebody else, can become a thing of the past. But because those issues have not been dealt with, of issues of transparency, the independence of these institutions are not that clear, that narrative will continue even if the fight is genuine.